What is going on, guys? Andrew of Newbar Gaming back here, and today we're going to be starting a new series for the channel called First Impressions, where we essentially take a look at the first 2 to 4 hours of gameplay of a game I've never touched before and review it purely based off of that. My format for these is essentially going to be talking about the game in 3 different categories: graphics and audio, gameplay, and story. Now, as you can see from that first little clip, today we're going to be tackling Spider-Man for the PlayStation 4. Now, I've been a huge Spider-Man fan my entire life, so I'm definitely going to be a little bit biased on this one. Finally caved and bought a PS4 a few days ago. This was the first game I picked up, and I gotta tell you, this game received a ton of hype, and so far, I'm believing all of it. It does not disappoint to me whatsoever, so bit of a spoiler alert as to my opinions in a lot of these categories here. So bearing all that in mind, let's go ahead and jump right into it with the graphics and audio category. Now, before we start talking about the graphics of this game, allow me to give a little bit of context as to where I've been on video games here recently. For the most part, for the past 3 or 4 years prior to when I got my Nintendo Switch about 6 months back, I hadn't touched a lot of newer console games for a long time. I just didn't have the time in my schedule to really mess with that type of stuff. And so, you know, I'm definitely going to be a little bit behind on the times in terms of what the typical graphics standards are and what I expect from things. But keeping that in position, I don't think that necessarily detracts from how well this game performs. Keep in mind, I do have a PlayStation 4 Pro, so my system's going to be scaling everything from 1080p to 2160p, which just looks absolutely gorgeous for this game. All of the cutscenes and motions move exactly how they should. There's no like textural errors that I've spotted so far in terms of, you know, in a lot of older games when a character would move their arm, sometimes you could kind of glitch your way through plants, those types of things. Nope, everything's going absolutely perfectly. They even went so far as to make it when you're web slinging through the city, you have to actually be near a building for you to cling through. I feel like sometimes in some of the older Spider-Man games, you could kind of just sling and they'd point it somewhere off screen towards the sky and sort of just make it work, if you will, where if you weren't paying a whole lot of attention, it didn't necessarily affect it, but if you were keeping a close eye out, it was kind of like, wait a second, did I just web sling onto a cloud? Nope, this keeps everything consistent with that, and it just adds to that cinematic effect to the experience. Makes it feel very realistic, once more like you're playing as Spider-Man. And while I wouldn't say this game goes so far as to be like photorealistic, a lot of the expressions are really believable, and I kind of prefer my games to not quite be photorealistic in the first place. Probably just a personal preference thing, but I've always liked the idea of games kind of staying in that fictional world. I like the idea of being able to escape into them. And this one really pushes the boundaries of making it realistic enough that it feels real, but not to the point where it's like I'm watching real people doing it, if that makes any sense. Although I will give them some credit in terms of the photorealistic category in that a couple times when you're looking at photos on desks, though not all the time, particularly there's a scene where you play as Peter and you're in Aunt May's like charitable area. If you go to her desk and look at some of those photos, particularly from a little bit of a distance, they look practically like they're real, which is terrifying to see how far graphics have come for games, but incredible at the same time. So in the graphics category, I think this game absolutely kills it. Moving on to the soundtracking category, this thing feels like something straight out of an MCU film in terms of the soundtrack. You've got a couple signature themes, including the title theme, which I'll play for you guys real quick. And it's songs like that that really add to this feeling like you're playing through a movie. This replicates kind of the soundtracking format I think a lot of the MCU films have taken, in that you've kind of got your big themes, but then you've got a lot of quieter moments too, where the music almost backs off entirely and simply adds a little bit of texture here and there to the action that's going on. Very reminiscent of kind of the Captain America style film format, where you've got a couple of these themes that are really triumphant and stick to the character, a couple more somber things here and there, but for the most part the soundtrack is more there as like some extra flair, which I think works for a format like this as opposed to something like a JRPG, where a lot of times the soundtrack is a primary driving factor actor of the story that's going on to help set the mood. Here it's kind of allowing the characters and such to do so. Not that JRPGs don't, but hopefully I wasn't contradicting myself too much there, and you guys understand what I'm getting at in terms of prominence of soundtrack and the different approaches of handling that. Regardless, I think this game once more hits the nail on the head between mixing that with its somewhat realistic graphic style, and you've got this sort of, once more, overall cinematic experience. It feels like you're playing through a movie. Now, adding a little bit to the graphical elements of things, they put a lot of detail into this game. They really paid attention to creating an environment that feels realistic, and that's what I think put the MCU films above a lot of the earlier superhero films, in that the world around you feels very complete. If you look at like a bulletin board, right, rather than just having generic notes written on there, you have things that kind of chain into the universe, or subtle Easter eggs to other things, or just seem to be pointing to something you would see in, say, like an actual high school billboard, or in the case of Peter's room in the opening scene here, he's got like photos, he's got news stories about when he captured certain villains. He's even got a poster hanging on his wall about when he first started as Spidey and was doing like those minor league pro wrestling types of stints to earn some extra money, and he was just still being called the Spider. Regardless, it creates this sense of completeness, which just feels fantastic. I mean, once more, I cannot emphasize to you guys enough how real the world in this game feels, and that's fantastic. That's always what Marvel really hit the ball out of the park with when it came to their comic books. It's what sort of distinguished them from another company like DC, is their characters always felt grounded, and I think everything about that's executed really well here. The voice actors are also doing great. We even have a couple of them who have come back from doing Spider-Man characters previously, like the actress who does Aunt May in this. She played Aunt May in another Spider-Man TV show, or even some of the other ones have experience doing like comic characters in the past. For example, the voice actress for Mary Jane, she played Selina Kyle in the Batman Telltale series. So on the whole, guys, great in terms of graphics and audio. I'm really enjoying it. It just feels cinematic to me. So if you're into movies, especially like the Marvel movies, you're going to feel right at home with this game, which once more, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I love those movies, so I'm loving the experience of this game when it comes to this type of stuff. So that's going to bring us into our second category for this, which is going to be the gameplay. Now, if you ever played any of the Batman Arkham games, that more or less set the tone for pretty much every superhero game that involves you punching things from there on out, and that a lot of games learn from its formula, which isn't necessarily bad. Now, I haven't played any of the Batman games since Arkham City Game of the Year Edition came back way back on the Xbox 360. I really enjoyed that game, but I gotta say, I don't know how much they've improved it in the future Arkham games, but at least comparing this to Arkham City, and this is several years later, so I think this game does a much better job. It takes everything that you liked about that system and upgrades it, in my opinion. Everything feels very cinematic in that this combat experience is extremely rewarding. If you learn the combos, and you're quick to react to things, if you take advantage of all the different types of moves Spidey can do, you can keep the combat varied and fun. You can watch a lot of different things happen. You have the special takedowns, which you can activate by pressing, I believe it's triangle and circle at the same time, and those vary depending on where Spidey is in relation to the character, once more adding to the realism of it. And it doesn't really slow down the combat when you do that. It just kind of flows straight from whatever he's doing. The counters are varied, the upgrades all respawn really nicely. Everything feels great. Once more, you feel like you're Spider-Man. That is the biggest thing and the most enjoyable thing about this game, is that you feel like you're Spidey, and that's incredible. And I'm playing the game currently on the hardest difficulty, and I think the challenge is nice. It forces me to actually react like Spidey would. I feel like I'm intimidated by the fact that, I've got 10 guys coming at me. I need to have my, my instincts, my reflexes ready to go in order to respond to everything that's happening. And your enemies even have some variety to them. They have like big guys who you can't deal with in normal situations. You have to stun them with the webs first, and then you can take care of them. You have enemies that need to be somehow countered first before you can take care of them. You have enemies that need to be launched into the air first. You have enemies using guns, etc., etc. They add a lot of variety to the overall combat experience. Now, I talked a little bit about webs there, and that adds a lot to it too. Spidey has his web shooters, which they don't just let you abuse, but they can be used to stun enemies mid-combat, and he can use the webs to pull enemies towards him and everything else. It's integrated very smoothly into everything that you're doing, which I very much enjoy. Adding to that, you also have a gadget system, which grants you access to a lot of different things. Now, currently, the only ones I have unlocked are his basic web shooters, which are more or less rapid fire. You have like 6 shots and then you regen them as you go through combos. I like that system because it prevents you from abusing anything too much. Then I have like the instant web shot, which instantly fully webs an enemy to completely stun them. And then I also have the spider drone, which I can deploy to help fight alongside me, and it shoots these blasts to deal damage to enemies, and all of those, once more, add to the variety. The combat always feels interesting to me because I feel like every fight goes a little bit differently, and I feel like if I want to just mix up my style, even that makes the fight go differently. I can go from doing like stealth, where I'm sneaking around and doing stealth takedowns, once more, a little bit reminiscent of Arkham City, but I feel like this game does it better in terms of variety and reward to those knowing the combos. But you can do like stealth takedowns, you can flee back into the shadows, you can web up enemies, you can web them to walls in order to take them down, you can chain takedowns, you can use your abilities, which they have in this. Every suit kind of unlocks a new ability for you, so as you unlock new suits through the game, you're unlocking new abilities with that, and you can attach one of those to your suits. For example, the one I'm really enjoying right now, it builds up more of, I forget the term that they use, but essentially it's like this stamina bar, and the higher it gets, the more powerful Spidey gets. And you can either use that stamina bar to restore health, or you can use it to do an instant takedown, which I had mentioned before. Those are like the most cinematic parts of fighting, and this ability allows you to generate that much faster. And there are other ones that like make it so you can do like dashes through enemies and all kinds of other things. Overall, you can kind of customize your experience. While we were talking about suits there, you can even make Spidey look different. You got some like 20-ish suits to choose from, all of which are really awesome. One of which is even Spider-Man Noir, which was Into the Spider-Verse having recently come out, and that movie was a blast. Who doesn't want to play as Nick Cage Spider-Man? It'd be a good time just to enjoy that. So, once more, gameplay, smooth, everything responds the way it should. I mean, even some of the button mappings are creative, but unique. For example, in order for you to web sling throughout the city, you have to use R2. Well, think about that for a second. When Spidey's doing his web slinging motion, if you have your middle finger on R2, that's very similar to when he pushes his middle finger and his ring finger down in order to sling a web in real life. Very clever on Sony's part without making it awkward. You also have your typical RPG elements, which I should mention here, in that you do level up, your health increases, you can choose to unlock new combos. There's like different quote-unquote skill trees you can go down. One is like combo-oriented and defense-oriented. One's like oriented around your web slinging, and then one's more like creative and innovation types of stuff. So it's all very well done. I love the feel of it. Once more, I feel like it's an overall smoother Arkham game, and I think I also probably like it more just because I'm a bigger fan of Spidey than I am of Batman, but to each their own on that. So I think if you enjoy action games, you can definitely get a kick out of playing through this, and as I've said several times, you feel like you're Spider-Man, and that's a huge deal and something they hit the nail on the head with. But I should also make the note that there are chunks of this where you aren't playing as Spidey. I've already hit on the Spidey chunks a lot, so let's go ahead and dive into those a little bit, because these kind of derive from that action game type of formula. In that there are chunks where you're playing as Peter, there's also was a brief period of time in the chunk of this that I played where you play as Mary Jane. And these are more like investigative types of scenes where you're interacting with characters, doing like some talking missions, doing some hacking, which I'll get into a second because that kind of slows the pace of things in my opinion. And then you're also taking like photos and those types of things. I thought the Peter and especially the Mary Jane mission was a nice change of pace because it felt more like a mystery and investigative game for a little bit. Kind of offsets the action, especially considering I like to stop and fight a lot of the street crime in this game, which is really well integrated. It kind of, you get signals over the radio of, oh, criminal alert, you can stop this crime, and I like to stop and do that. Once more, I like to pretend I'm playing as Spidey, and I know if I was Spidey, I'd stop whatever I'm doing and go help those people. So with that being the case, I do that a lot, leads to a lot of action together, so these little breaks with investigating things and taking pictures and such feel nice. And it's also cool to see Mary Jane's perspective when you get to play as her. You get to do it in like a museum mission. That's the one I played. I won't spoil what's going on there in case you plan on playing through the game yourself, but it's just a nice way to break up things. You do also have some light puzzle solving, which can get a little bit annoying. For instance, I was mentioning how you get radioed about crimes and such. The way that you manage to expand where you can hear about the crimes is to go to these Oscorp towers and essentially fix them up. My biggest issue with that is the puzzles aren't very fun, and they just feel sort of tedious. The Osborn Tower ones aren't too bad in that it's basically just you rotating the two joysticks until you get a radio wavelength to line up with the one that it's asking you for. So that's not too bad, but you also have ones in Doc Ock's lab, most of which seem to be optional so far to get you extra XP, but there were a couple you had to do initially, which involve like playing with circuits to get the right voltage, and then also matching up like DNA sample things. So I guess overall not too bad since none of it's technically required other than those first couple you have to do when you meet Doc Ock, but they do feel a little bit awkward, and I'm wondering if there was maybe a way they could make them more fun? I don't know, I have mixed feelings on it because I feel like the way they did it is at least a sort of accurate way of how those puzzles function a little bit, and it feels real to what Peter would actually be doing in a lab, which adds to that authenticity. But at the same time, it kind of drains a little bit of the fun out of it. So I have mixed feelings on the puzzles, but overall, so far so good with the game. So as a whole on the gameplay, I think they did a really nice job making the majority of the game that really nice action formula they have set up with a lot of cinematography and everything else that works out really nicely. Or I'm sorry, cinematics, not cinematography. And then breaking it up a little bit here and there with some investigative scenes, some talking things, and a little bit of like camera shooting and those types of aspects. So on the whole, guys, gameplay is absolutely stellar here. Alright, so let's go ahead and move on to talking a little bit about story. Now here I might end up giving away some minor spoilers, but bear in mind I've only played through the first like 4 hours of the game, so anything I may spoil is stuff you pick up pretty quick if you're playing the game. So if you want to avoid all spoilers entirely, go ahead and click off this video now, and I'm going to resume talking about the stories in 3, 2, 1. Alright, so when you jump into playing as Spider-Man in this game, you go ahead and take down the Kingpin. Now, the impression we get from the way that they're throwing like snarky remarks back and forth, and the fact that MJ's talking about like weapons he's used to cut up Peter when you're in that museum mission, and she's investigating Kingpin's like goods that they were recovered when he was taken down, and everything else, is that Kingpin and Spider-Man have a very long history in this universe. It lines up well, given the fact that we're introduced to a Spidey that's in his early 20s. I'll touch a little bit on that later because it's an aspect I really like, but staying on the topic of Kingpin, he's taken down right away, and this leaves a lot of reminiscence going on throughout the city. You can actually run into people who are just, they look like casual walking citizens who are trying to kill you to get revenge for Kingpin. A nice little aspect, once more, makes that universe feel complete, feel whole around you. Adding to that, there's also construction sites you can run into where they're doing sketchy business for the Kingpin, and taking those down gives you kind of bonus XP. It completes these side mission type of things for you. So it adds to that completeness. It essentially feels real. I mean, you took down a big mob boss. There's going to be people still loyal to him. Essentially, he's still in jail, and they figure, you know, if he gets back out, he'll continue doing his thing. Now, in terms of the overall direction of the story, we haven't been given a whole lot of clue as to that yet, at least where I am, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I can talk a little bit about some of where our characters are at. I already mentioned how Peter's older in this game. He's like 22 to 23 would be my guess. He does seem to be out of college, so I'm leaning more towards that 23 type of side. He's got that sort of like messy, straight out of college type of apartment vibe, which I'm totally okay with. It keeps most of the relatability of the high school form of Peter Parker we're used to, while also bringing him into a little bit of a more mature area where we don't have to worry too much about telling the origin story most people in this generation have already heard a million times because of the number of times the franchise has been rebooted or retold through cartoons, video games, movies, its comic books, etc. Which, once more, I'm totally fine with. I also like this age of Peter Parker because we get to see how he develops a little bit, how he manages to juggle being Spider-Man while also being a full-fledged adult, because that does tack on a lot of extra responsibilities. We get to see his usual little bit of overwhelmedness as well, and the fact that he's juggling a job working for Doc Ock, which I'm going to touch on that in a second as well, while also doing his whole thing with Spider-Man, and he's barely scraping by on rent. He's a lot of times making snarky remarks about that. You know, the criminals maybe even donating some of their time to helping him pay his rent, and those types of things. I very much enjoy it. Adds to that completeness again. So where are we at with Doc Ock, since I touched on him a little bit? Is interesting. He has the arms, like you see him toying with the arms that would make him Dr. Octopus in his lab, but he also seems on really good terms with Peter, and Peter even mentions before he visits him, he has to get back to Doc before he gets too far into his work or something. So I'm wondering if that's a reference to the fact that in this universe, Peter's already beaten him when he goes evil, and then this is a re-sanified version of Doc Ock that's doing good. That's a consistent theme amongst a lot of Spider-Man villains, is most of the time they start off good, or not most of the time, but a lot of them start off good, they're genuine scientists, then an experiment goes horribly wrong, kind of twists them into an evil fate. Doc Ock, Lizard, Norman Osborn, depending on the version, those types of villains, and I can definitely see that being the case here. I mean, we see in that opening billboard scene on his room that he's got, or not billboard, bulletin board in his room, that he's taken down a lot of villains before, so I'm thinking Doc Ock probably falls into that case, and I really enjoy their relationship. I mean, Doc Ock seems to be like a friendly, almost fatherly type of figure to Peter. He requires him to show up, but he also believes thoroughly in the work they're doing, knows Peter's a good kid, and is willing to work with him some. Heck, it's even funny because he discovers Peter working on some of his Spider-Man tech and just assumes he's one of the people working on Spider-Man's tech for him, and he doesn't necessarily think he's Spider-Man. A really neat detail. It also reminds us that, hey, wait a second here, to the common world, Peter Parker's a nerd who would never be doing this, right? And that's not a knock against nerds, believe me, I'm a nerd myself. But adds to that sense of realism and staying consistent to the original incarnations of the character. Now, the other major characters we've gotten so far are also Mary Jane, who, once more, with these guys being older, it's neat to see them play out that relationship some more, and it actually turns out in this universe, Mary Jane and Peter have fallen apart some, and it seems like they haven't talked for several months, which I very much enjoy since I think that's adding to the realism again in terms of, if you have someone that you really care about that's doing the superhero gig, it's unpredictable how often they'll be able to show up to dates. You're not sure if they're actually going to come home every night or if you can guarantee that their safety, and just everything feels so unpredictable. I can see that definitely putting a relationship on the fences, especially when you're both still trying to find yourselves as young adults in the world, but at the same time they do reconnect quickly and everything just feels very genuine. They even go on a sort of pseudo date right after the museum scene where Peter rescues MJ, and they're talking and that type of thing, and then Peter's got to run off and do his Spider-Man thing again because police cars come flying by. Once more, adds to the genuity of it. I enjoy watching those two characters interact. MJ's also got a lot of strength in this. She's investigating stuff going on with the Kingpin on her own without fear, which I think is really cool. I like it when they manage to have a character that doesn't have powers at all, still do a lot of bold and courageous things. Now, while we're on the topic of characters being bold and courageous, we've also got Yuri, I believe her last name is Watanabe, who is a cop that works alongside Spider-Man. A little bit of a different twist here. A lot of times, usually it's like Gwen Stacy's father, I'm pretty sure, that ends up working alongside him, but regardless, she seems to be a really cool character. She comes to trust Peter. In one of the backpacks that you discover, you can find that she gave him like her personal phone number and such, and this comes up quite a bit because she does end up calling him rather frequently to send him on missions or talk to him about info on the Kingpin or whatever, and it's just a cool interaction between those two. Reminds me a little bit of the old Commissioner Gordon and Batman type of circumstance for a lot of things, which isn't bad at all. Once more, a nice working relationship there. So that's going to actually about wrap it up in terms of the main characters. I feel like I've rambled long enough, but I like the way this world is set up a lot. I'm going to move on to just like a couple of Easter eggs here. I already mentioned the one about the wrestling and that type of thing, how Peter has that poster hanging in his room of the first time he did the minor wrestling stint to get some money. They also do a nice job of world building with J. Jonah Jameson now having his own podcast, which you can tune into as you're swinging through the streets, and he's ranting about Spider-Man, getting people on there, and there seems to be a nice variety of dialogue programmed in the game for that, all of which feels very accurate to his character, and him being explosive, very outright with his opinions, claiming he's protecting the city when he's really just hating on Spider-Man a lot of the times. Overall, very fun to watch that unfold. So far within those first couple hours, they don't seem to give you a lot of clues to where the story is fully going, but I'm okay with that. I mean, even just doing slice of life of Spider-Man is really fun, although it does seem to be starting to get somewhere in that there are some mysterious weapons that appear in the museum. I'm guessing that's going to tie into it, and also the guy who works alongside Aunt May at the Charity Foundation seems a little bit on the mysterious side as well. So with all that being said, guys, let's go ahead and wrap it up here. On the whole, I would say this game is absolutely fantastic. If you enjoy Marvel movies, if you enjoy Spider-Man, if you enjoy action games, and if you have a PlayStation 4, would 100% recommend picking it up. Or if you're just looking for a nice story with some good characters to watch unfold, this definitely fits the bill. I would say it's one of the best games I've played in a very long time and doesn't really disappoint in any field, but once more, I'm a Spider-Man fanboy. So as always, be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. If not, constructive criticism is always welcome, and I'll catch you guys next time with some more video game first impressions.